Good morning, everybody. Today's reading is going to be taken from the book of Proverbs, chapter 2, verses 1 through 8. These verses speak to the value of having wisdom and understanding in our lives. My son, if you receive my words and treasure up my commandments with you, making your ear attentive to wisdom and inclining your heart to understanding, yes, if you call out for insight and raise your voice for understanding, if you seek it like silver and search for it as for hidden treasures, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He is a shield to those who walk in integrity, guarding the paths of justice and watching over the way of his saints.
Good morning, church. Good to see everybody. I wanted to start out with a bit of a self-reflection question today. Here it is. What is the greatest pursuit of life according to you? You ever thought about that? What would you say if you had to answer that question this morning? It's an important question to consider, right? There's many answers around us. Our culture, for instance, might say, the most important thing to pursue is whatever makes you happy. And you know what, on the surface that might sound good, but that kind of pursuit doesn't always lead to something of real value. For instance, what if the thing that made you the most happy was like the latest TV? What if that was your pursuit? I came across an ad the other day that I'm really excited about, and I wanted to share it with you guys. It's an ad for a cutting-edge piece of tech, and it promises to make your life so much better. Here it is. It's amazing, right? Not 7 inches, not 10 inches, but 12 inches, a 12-inch screen. And if that wasn't enough, it also has a built-in FM radio. I mean, what more can you ask for? I thought you guys would be more impressed. Well, if that one doesn't do it for you, then maybe this one will here. I mean, check this thing out. Sony says that it's the best television that they've ever made. And it's got a 32-inch screen. Isn't that amazing? The remote, too. I love the remote. If you can see that down in the corner there, it's as big as most TVs we have. But anyway, look at this thing. It's amazing, right? But maybe not. Maybe that's still not doing it for you. Well, how about this one? This one's maybe a little more modern. It says it has Motion Accelerator Turbo Plus, whatever that is. And 120 hertz, 4K resolution. I mean, now maybe some people are starting to, their eyes are lighting up now. You see where I'm going with this, right? If TVs are the thing that makes you happy, then our friends in the advertising world would be happy to sell you the next one, and then the next one, and then the next one, and you'll spend your whole life chasing the next greatest thing. And when you finally get it, there will just be a new advertisement with the next one that's just a little bit better. It's a bit of a silly example, but the thing about TVs and pretty much everything in that category, a lot of other things that we find ourselves pursuing in life, is that they all have one thing in common. They all end up in a place like this. So many things in this pile of junk here were once advertised as the latest and greatest thing that you simply must have in order for your life to be complete. But the garbage dump, I love the garbage dump because it serves as a sobering reminder for us. Not everything in this life that we pursue is valuable, even if it makes us happy. If we spend our time and our money and our energy investing our life into things that end up in a garbage dump, then what does that say about the value of the things that we're giving our lives to? There has to be something better to pursue than the things of this world. Some of the best minds in human history have tackled this question for the ages. Socrates, for instance, he really gave a good effort to this. He said that the best thing you can pursue is virtue. Virtue, striving for what is good and for what is just. And I think he gets us a lot closer to something that matters, right? Because at least striving for virtue is going to get you something that lasts longer than, whatever makes you happy for the moment. But the problem is, or maybe the piece that's missing is who gets to define what is good and just? How do we know which virtues are virtuous? How do we know what to pursue? Well, there's another man in history who tackled this question as well. His name is King Solomon. Now, the Bible says that King Solomon was the wisest man who ever lived, which is pretty cool. And many of King Solomon's teachings were recorded in the book of Proverbs, which Ray just read for us. But before we get into that reading, I'd like to look at what he said, what King Solomon said about our question today, about what is the most important thing to strive for. Here's what is written in Proverbs 3, verses 13 to 15. He said, "Blessed are those who find wisdom, those who gain understanding, for she is more profitable than silver and returns a better yield than gold. She is more precious than rubies, and nothing you desire can compare with her." Based on this, I think we'd have to say that the greatest pursuit in Solomon's mind was wisdom. It says that it's more precious than silver, than gold, than jewels. Anything in this world, anything that this world has to offer does not compare with wisdom. And so I want to explore this idea with you this morning because it's the task at hand for this year, right? We've been talking about growing spiritually in 2024. And in March, we've been looking at the essentials of spiritual growth. What are those things that we absolutely must have if we want to grow to spiritual maturity? And today we're going to see that pursuing wisdom is one of those essentials. But what is wisdom anyway? I'd like to spend the first part of our sermon tackling that question. What is it exactly? And then we can answer the question, well, why should we pursue it? Why should we desire wisdom so much anyway? What's so good about it? And then finally, we can look at the how question. How do we actually do that? How do we pursue wisdom? So let's start with the what question. When you think about people that are famous for being wise, like who's coming to your mind right now? There's probably a lot of answers, right? Maybe it's someone who's really smart, like high IQ. Or maybe it's someone who's doing extremely well by the standards of this world. Maybe like a Fortune 500 CEO, maybe someone who's killing it in the stock market. Maybe it's a philosopher type person. Maybe it's someone who has the answers to all of life's questions of meaning and the questions about how do you become successful or how do you become happy. And I'm not trying to say that any of those things are evil in and of themselves, but did you know that there's a difference between what the world considers to be wise or what the world considers to be wisdom and what God considers to be wisdom? Check out what it says in James chapter 3. Starting in verse 14, he says, "But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom doesn't come from doesn't come from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy, of good fruit, impartial, and sincere." So God's wisdom is a wisdom that has pure motives. It loves peace. It considers others. It submits to others. It's full of mercy. It bears good fruit. It's not biased and it's sincere. That's a pretty amazing description of what wisdom looks like. Worldly wisdom, on the other hand, is quite different. It says here that it's bitter, envious, and selfish. What's this passage telling us? Well, I think it boils down to one thing, really. The difference between godly wisdom and worldly wisdom is the one who the wisdom is trying to honor. Worldly wisdom is aimed at honoring self, promoting self, and trying to honor self and do what's best for self. Whereas godly wisdom is aimed at honoring God or bringing honor to God. So true wisdom, the wisdom that we want to pursue for spiritual growth, is a kind of wisdom that honors God. But our passage today helps us to see something else along these same lines as well. In verse 6 of what Ray read for us, it says that wisdom actually comes from God. We get it from Him. So already we see two ways that wisdom is tied to God, connected with God. It honors God, and it originates from God. We cannot separate God from wisdom. They're so tied together. And I like to think of it as what I've written here. Wisdom is like seeing your world as God sees it and living your life as if God were living it. This concept is summed up in a phrase that I know you've heard before: fearing God. Fearing God. Like it says in Proverbs 9:10, it says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding." If you feel like you're lacking wisdom this morning, start here. It says that the fear of the Lord is the place to start. That's where wisdom begins, fearing God. And actually, in many ways, fearing God is sort of like an equivalent for wisdom even. In Job 28:28, God said to man, "Behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And to turn away from evil is understanding." So in many ways, being wise simply means to fear God. But what does that mean exactly? What does it mean to fear God anyways? It's something that I think we get misunderstood commonly in our world today. We think about the word fear as in being afraid, being terrified, right? But that's not really what fearing God means. Check out this example here. I'm just going to paint the scene here a little bit. When Moses led God's people out of Egypt into the desert, way back in the Old Testament in Exodus. At one point, he gathered all the Israelites around a mountain, Mount Sinai, and he showed his presence to them. God showed his presence to the people in a special way through this powerful storm and this smoke and this fire that was on the mountain. And from within the storm, God actually spoke in an audible way to the people, the masses. All of the Israelites heard it, and they were terrified. They were terrified by the whole ordeal. And this is their response that's recorded in Exodus 20, starting in verse 19. The people said to Moses, "You speak to us, and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, lest we die." Moses said to the people, "Do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of Him may be before you, and that you may not sin." So here's a great example of how the English word fear doesn't really have enough depth to translate all that's being said in the original language. Moses said, "Do not fear." But then, in the same breath, he says that they should fear. So which is it? Fear or not to fear? That is the question. Was Moses losing his mind? Obviously, there's something lost in the translation here, right? And it turns out that the original word, the original Hebrew word for fear, as in it can mean two sort of things. It can mean fear as in to be afraid or to be terrified about something, which is the first use that I've highlighted there on the screen. But it can also mean something else. It can mean something like reverence or respect that our English word for fear doesn't really capture very well. And the second meaning is what I've highlighted there on the screen secondly. And it shows up again in lots of other places. This is one of the more clear examples. In Proverbs 8, verse 13, it says, "The fear of the Lord is the hatred of evil." Fear of the Lord is a hatred of evil. So obviously in this case, fear doesn't mean, to be afraid. That wouldn't work, right? It's the equivalent in this case of hating evil. So by extension, we can say that the fear of the Lord is choosing to love the things or pursue the things that God loves. And that's just what we see here as well in Deuteronomy 10. It says, "And now Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you but to fear the Lord your God and to walk in all His ways, to love Him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments and statutes of the Lord, which I am commanding you today for your good." The summary statement here at the beginning, the summary of this passage is to fear the Lord. And then Moses goes on to describe what that looks like. It involves walking in His ways, loving Him, serving Him with everything that they have, and doing all the things that He says is good for you. An example of this might be someone who's faced with a choice, right? Maybe you could picture yourself in this. Faced with a choice, but instead of rushing ahead just to do what this person thinks that they think is best, they stop and they consider what God would want in this situation. And after doing so, they realize that, you know what, the thing that they want to do doesn't really line up with what God would want, so they change their mind. They change their mind and do the thing that God would want them to do instead. That's what fearing God looks like. To give God the priority even above yourself and the decisions that you make. The one who fears the Lord is the one who lives their life as if God was living it. And this is really what wisdom is. The wise person is the one who constantly runs their choices in life through a filter of what they know about God, about His priorities, about His nature, about His commands, and then they adjust their path based on that. That's what wisdom looks like. So if wisdom looks like fearing God and honoring Him with your life, then the next thing we might wonder is, well, why would I want to do that? That sounds difficult. That sounds hard. That sounds uncomfortable. Why would I want to pursue something like that? Well, it goes back to the passage that we just looked at from Deuteronomy, this one here. In the last part, the last verse, it says that God's commands are for our good. For our good. And I think that's really what it comes down to. Whether or not we actually believe that is true. What do you think about when you consider the commands of God? Do they seem like a nuisance to you? Do they seem like they're holding you back from something that would be better in life? Do you approach God's commands like you might approach an obstacle, something that you have to try to find loopholes for or workarounds in so you can still do what you want to do? I get it. I've been there. In many ways, I still am. I'm still working on that. Maybe we all are. And I want to share with you something this morning that I think might help us with that. Alicia sent me this a while back. I don't know where she got it, and I'm not sure who wrote it, but I'm going to share it anyway because I really like the words. It says, the enemy didn't tempt Adam and Eve to murder, to steal, or even to tell a lie. He tempted them to question the word of God. Just know that his tactics haven't changed. I really like that, It simplifies things a lot. We often imagine that Satan is out to get us to do some terrible thing. He just wants to make us do some really awful, terrible thing. But most of the time, it's a lot more subtle than that, I think. And this is the crux of the matter, really. It's the root of the sin problem that's plagued humanity ever since the beginning. It's like watching a TV show where you already know how it's going to end right from the beginning because every episode is the exact same. Sin is like that too. Every time it's the same old story. Sure, some of the details change, but the underlying story is unchanging. We're tempted to question God's wisdom and substitute our own. When we swallow the lie that God's ways are not really that good for us and we should just justify it by doing what we want instead. And the result is the same. It's never good for us. Maybe that's where you're at today. Maybe you're facing such a difficult decision in your life and you just can't imagine taking God's path because it just seems too hard. It just seems like it's not going to work. And if that's you, just remember these words here. Satan is really good at blinding us to the truth. And just like he did with Adam and Eve, God had a good path in store for them. And they just threw it all away over something temporary that wasn't going to last. Don't replay the tape. Don't replay the tape. Remember that God's ways are good because He has a much better idea of what is good for us than what we're tempted to believe from the world. Like what it says in our reading today from Proverbs 2, verses 6 to 8. It says, "For the Lord gives wisdom. From His mouth come knowledge and understanding, for He holds success in store for the upright. He is a shield to those whose walk is blameless, for He guards the course of the just and protects the way of His faithful ones." This is why we should pursue wisdom right here. God's wisdom, because it leads to success. Because His wisdom is a shield to us. His wisdom guards us and it protects us from the damage of sin. Contrary to what you might hear from old Satan, the path that God has for you is actually a good one. A really good one. When we know His ways and live those ways out, we will be blessed. And I'm not talking about the health and wealth gospel here. I'm talking about something so much better than that. A life that counts for something. A life that matters. Remember, wisdom is seeing your life like God sees it and living your life like God is living it. A life of wisdom is a life that's lived in harmony with your Creator. We'll be living for something that lasts for eternity instead of just for the next few years. We can experience a life of purpose that goes beyond the next paycheck or the next thing on the schedule or the next weekend. We can contribute to something that lasts forever. I want that, don't you? We can truly succeed. Don't waste your life. Don't waste your life on the lies of our enemy. The wisdom of this world is not where it's at. So if we really grasp the significance of pursuing God's wisdom and we see the value in pursuing it for ourselves, then the next question is, how do we get it? What do we actually do to gain that kind of wisdom? Well, the Bible certainly helps us with this a lot. The first place I want to go to is from Proverbs again. In chapter 4, verse 7, it says that the beginning of wisdom is this: get wisdom. Though it costs you all you have, get understanding. I love the simplicity of this command. Wisdom starts with getting wisdom. In other words, the first thing that you need to know about getting wisdom is that you need to be motivated to go and get it. The first thing that you need is a heart that says, give me wisdom. If we don't have that desire, then there's no point in talking about anything else. This goes back to what Jay talked about last week, right? We need to have a hunger and a thirst for righteousness. A hunger and a thirst for the good life that God has for us. Wisdom is the same. We need to really want it. We need to want God's ways more than we want our own, or more than we want the ways of the world. We need to want the success that comes from the wisdom of God more than we want the success that comes from the wisdom of the world. And it starts with wanting to get that wisdom. You know, I'm going to ask you, right? And I'm asking myself this as well. You know, do you really want God's wisdom? Deep down in your soul, do you have a desire to learn and apply it to your life? Or are you just sort of content to stay where you're at? Or are you just sort of content with the status quo? Are you fine to just kind of coast and do things just like the rest of the world does them? We need to start with that desire for wisdom. That's where it starts. But it's more than a desire, right? Because wisdom is more than just knowledge, right? It's putting the knowledge of God, the things we know to be true about Him, into action. It's living out the commands of God. It's seeing your life the way that God sees it and living your life as if God were living it. It's knowledge in action. And that means that this command to get wisdom is about pursuing a certain kind of life. We get wisdom when we practice living it out. We have to live a life according to the wisdom of God, and in doing so, we're going to get wisdom. We're going to get experience points, if you like. If you want to become wise in the ways of God, you have to be willing to live in the ways of God, to experience living this thing out. The wise person, according to God, is not the one who just reads the Bible and acquires a whole bunch of knowledge for themselves. That makes you knowledgeable, but it doesn't make you wise. If you want to get wisdom, you have to practice living out what you know, living out what you believe in, putting into practice the things that we know about God. This is so important that Solomon says that even if it costs you everything, your whole life, pursue this one thing. Get that understanding. Get that wisdom. It's the most important thing. What's most important to you in your life right now? Being busy with kids' activities, retiring and traveling the world, crushing it in your career, passing your grades. I mean, not that any of that stuff is all bad, but that's not really the pursuit that God calls us to, right? It's about living out the wisdom of God. It's about fearing Him, taking His nature, His priorities, His will into account in the way that we live. It's about actually doing it. And if we're struggling with this, if we're struggling to gain wisdom, we might think about starting with what James says in James 1:5. He said, if any of you lacks wisdom, You should ask God, who gives it generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. So there it is. An amazing promise from God. If we lack wisdom, we can simply ask for it. And James says that God will grant it generously. But again, and I know this is repetitive, but we need to hear it. Wisdom is not merely knowledge, right? It's knowledge in action. And maybe we imagine, God answering this promise here in this verse by just sort of dropping a bunch of knowledge out of the sky, and it's just going to land into our brain, and then all of a sudden we'll just be wise and we'll know all these things. But that's not really wisdom, right? That's knowledge. Wisdom is knowledge in action, and if that's the truth, then God's answer to this promise might look more like Him giving us experiences in life with trying to live out His commands. If you ask God, He will give you opportunities to live it out. He will give you experience. But it won't matter unless we take Him up on those opportunities and take Him up on those experiences. We have to be willing to walk with Him in His way of life if we want to gain that wisdom, which is why James says later on in the same book, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by what? Their impressive Bible knowledge, their ability to answer hard questions, by how long they've been a Christian." No, right? By their good life. By their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. That's how we'll show it, because that's how we will have it. We demonstrate wisdom in how we live, and we gain wisdom when we pursue God's way of life for us. As it says in our text from this morning, in the first 5 verses, it says, "My son, if you accept my words and store up my commands within you, turning your ear to wisdom and applying your heart to understanding, indeed, if you call out for insight and cry aloud for understanding, and if you look for it as for silver and search for it as for a hidden treasure, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God." All of these words here that I'm highlighting are action words, right? They're doing something. They describe someone who's aligning their life with God's ways and living out the wisdom of God. And like we said earlier, this describes someone who fears God. It's someone who considers God's ways in everything that they do and strives to live their lives according to the wisdom of God. This is the person who's truly wise. And this is the person who will experience spiritual growth and maturity in their life. So where are you at with this today? If you're anything like me, then you know that there's some room for growth in this area. It's so easy to confuse wisdom. This is my take on it. It's so easy to confuse wisdom with knowledge and imagine that if I just know more about God and I know more about His ways, then I'll be wise. But the Bible has made it clear today that pursuing wisdom is about much more than that. It's about much more than that. It's about seeing the true treasure that is found in pursuing wisdom and pursuing God's path for us, and then pursuing it in the way that we actually live and the things that we actually do. So what's the next step for you? What's the next step for me? Is there something in your life right now that you know is not in line with the wisdom of God? What would it take for you to make some progress in that area this week? Or maybe you're not even at the point yet where you really desire His wisdom. Maybe your next step is simply to do what James talks about and go to God and ask Him to grant you that desire and grant you that wisdom and that growth. All I can say is that for me personally is that I don't want to waste my time chasing things that don't matter. I don't want to give my time and attention and my energy to things that are just going to end up in a garbage dump one day and be replaced by the next shiny thing that tries to draw my attention away from God. I don't want my calendar to define what's important. I don't want my social media feed telling me what I need to pursue next. I want what He wants. I want to pursue His wisdom, and I want the life that God has for me, because His life is infinitely more valuable than what this world has to offer. I want that. I want to pursue it, and hopefully you'll join me in that pursuit. If you need someone to talk to about this, please know, as always, you can talk to me or another Christian that you trust. And if you need to take that next step, if you're ready to turn the keys of your life over to Jesus as your Lord and Savior, to put your faith in Him through repentance and baptism, we'd be happy to talk to you about that as well. Thank you for your time today.